I'm in the Senior and Disability Services office downtown, and I am also pursuing my master's in social work right now outside of work. And I am taking this training to better myself as a care coordinator and get more skills.
All right. Awesome. Are you doing the MSW program at UAA?
I am, yep.
Okay, so you're a pro at distance education and technology then, huh?
Well, one would think and hope.
Yeah, since they've gone totally distance delivered, right? It's a good
Yeah,
program though.
yeah, they use Zoom and Collaborate.
Yeah,
So,
good. I
yep.
prefer Zoom. We've used both here and we've just found Zoom to be a whole lot more stable and easy.
Yeah, I agree. My classes that have used Zoom have had less technical difficulties than the others.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so Katie, that leaves it to you, I guess. Tell us a bit about you. Who are you and what do you do and why are you here?
So I'm Katie Jones. I'm the family partner at Hope Community Resources as part of the Child and Family Supports team. It's a new position created to help support families in accessing resources. So I'm here because my supervisor, Carly Lopez, requested that I teach this class.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you. Delighted to have you. Okay, so I'm Ken. I'll be your server, and I came to Alaska back in 1978 for a summer vacation. I finished my undergraduate work, and I was gonna go back to graduate school in the fall, but the summer vacation never ended, and uh, I'd grown tired of academia, so I never went back to graduate school actually. And I've worked in Alaska in the disability service system since then, with the exception of about 3 years when I was down in Oregon. I've done a little bit of everything, and so I have, I think, a pretty good perspective on things. In terms of my professional career, I've done direct service, employment services, residential services, foster care services. I've always had an interest in working with people with challenging behaviors. My academic background is in applied behavior analysis, and even though I don't have the master's degree or the initials after my name, I think I've earned my stripes over the years in working with people who present persistent, ongoing, challenging behaviors. Um, Here at the center, I do a variety of different things. The University uh, Center for Human Development is our statewide center of excellence in developmental disabilities and education. There's only one of them here in our state. Other states have, larger states may have more than one. It's a network of 72 different centers originally that were put together to sort of connect the community and be able to leverage resources through universities. Our mission has pretty consistently been in workforce development, training, technical assistance, and consulting, that kind of thing. Um, I have a small academic program that I'm responsible for. It's an occupational endorsement certificate in children's behavioral health. Those courses are all distance delivered. Um, I am a foster parent of a young man who has complex medical conditions. He's lived with us for, man, going on 15 years now. The original plan was when we got him out of the hospital, get him tuned up and stabilized so that he could go back to his family. But in rural Alaska, they were unprepared and unwilling to work with a kid who had uh, chronic lung problems, a trach, and was on a ventilator. So he's now become kind of an institutionalized part of our family. Um, Prior to Chris coming to live with us, uh, my stepdaughter, my wife's daughter from a previous marriage, um, was instrumental in me kind of figuring out what family life is like. And it's a whole lot different than being a paid employee to support people. When you live it 24/7, it's very different. And when you're asking for supports and services as opposed to managing supports and services, it's very different. So Brianna, I think, was my graduate school, and Chris maybe is post-grad, I don't know. Uh, at any rate, they both had multiple pretty severe, complex medical conditions and disabilities. So I've become, sadly, very familiar with diapers, incontinence, trach changing, oxygen, ventilators, feeding tubes and pumps, and all various other sundry sorts of gadgets and gizmos. And it's influenced me quite a bit in terms of my view of the world. The other position that I just started working here at the center this year, right around the holiday times, is we had a person who worked at the center who left, and I was asked to assume the role of the family faculty with our LEND program. LEND is an acronym for Learning and Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities. Typically, the participants, the fellows in LEND, are professionals with advanced degrees who are entering into a one-year intensive educational program that focuses on neurodevelopmental disabilities, services, supports, and education, that sort of thing. And we usually try and pair our fellows up with families in the community, host families, families who may have a family member with a disability, a person who experiences a disability, so that they can get their toes wet and see a little bit of the differences between what professional life and family life might look like. So we're always looking for host families, and we have a cohort once every year for our LEND program. So if that's something that you might be interested in, you can find a little bit more about that on our website. If you are interested, let me know later and I'll try and get you some information. So that's a bit about me, who I am, and what I've done. Oh, I left out one part. I did work for the state for 7 years during what I think was the golden years of services for people with developmental disabilities. I worked there from 1990 to 1997. I was, in those days, we were developmental disability program specialists. I worked in the Anchorage office. At one time or another during my tenure there, I was responsible for Anchorage, South Central, which includes the Peninsula and Kodiak, a good bit of Western Alaska, the YK Delta area, Northwest Arctic area, so that whole region with Kotzebue and Nome. And I think that was another thing that was instrumental in sort of shaping my perception of services for people here in the state. It truly is a different world when you get to go to a traditional village and visit places where there are only maybe a few hundred people who live there year round, who are maybe still hauling water and don't have reliable utilities and those sorts of things. And the plane comes in the morning and it leaves in the night. And if the weather flares up, you could be there for a while. So I really appreciated having the opportunities to get out and to see some of real Alaska as well. I think that's also influenced my perceptions. We did some pretty cool things back in those days. Sadly, I don't think anybody even still at SDS who remembers those things very well. We developed the first service principles. We individualized funding for individuals. So instead of categorical services, money was assigned to people. The only state-operated institution for people with developmental disabilities, we successfully transitioned everyone from there into community services. So those were some pretty dynamic and exciting times to be part of the state. I was there when waivers were first developed, and I got out shortly thereafter. Okay, so enough about me. But that gives you a sense of who I am and what sort of things have shaped my thinking. And I also have a tendency to get on soapbox. So if I get off, yell at me or something. Let me see. Okay, the first thing that I want to share with you before we get started on content is just for those of you who've already been in there, this is just a quick overview. For others that may be new. So we're running our class through a learning management system that's called Moodle, and it's basically um, uh, a portal where we'll have information, content, materials, and things available for you. And when you first sign into our class, it'll take you to this page, the welcome page. It has the link here for joining the Zoom session in case you have misplaced it or lost it. It's always here in the welcome page, so just sign in through Moodle and you'll always be good. There's a navigation menu bar on the left-hand side, and if you click on Sessions, it will take you to this page, and then across the top you'll see Sessions 1, 2, etc. So there'll be information there for each specific session as we go through the course. On the left-hand navigation bar, again, you'll see something that's called a portfolio Dropbox. And part of the work that you'll do for this class is completing a couple of person-centered plans and the portfolios that you develop for those plans, one of them being a practice plan and then a final plan. Once you've completed everything, you can load the files into this Dropbox. Hopefully, what we'll see is that you have some graphics that you can share with us that are used for graphic facilitation of the planning session itself. And if you do have some files that are very large, we've created a Dropbox that is a little bit more user-friendly for those large files. So drop those things into the large files Dropbox. You'll see there are two others that are set up, one for the practice and one for the final. The next button is once you've completed those requirements, I've reviewed them, and you're essentially just, it's not a graded course in terms of receiving a letter grade. It's a competency-based course, so assuming that you've completed those portfolios and they're somewhat close to the criteria that we teach you during the course, then your material will be accepted, graded as accepted. At that point, then we'll alert you, and there's a course survey that's in Moodle, and you can find it in this survey and certificate of completion box. And the survey, once you've done the survey, then you'll be able to print directly from Moodle your certificate of completion. So that's an important piece for you to recognize and understand. Last but not least, there's a tab button for resource materials. Right now, there isn't anything in there. We have them in the individual sessions. So let's take a look at session 1 real quickly, and then we'll get started with content. So as you look at session 1, you'll see at the top the colorful welcome to person-centered thinking, planning, and services. It's our PowerPoint, basically. Underneath the slides for session 1, there are several resources that are available there. and you can just click on the arrows to open and close them. So the first one is person-centered planning course documents. Bear with me for a second. And within that folder are 3 others. There's a folder that includes all of the documents you'll need to complete a portfolio. And we'll look at those documents here in just a second. There's a folder with some assigned reading, 3 short articles that I'd like for you to read. And then there's a folder with additional resources. These include short articles or documents relevant to the course that we're going through. So we're all going to be spending the next 6 weeks or so talking about person-centered thinking, planning, and services, and you're going to demonstrate your competency with that by completing 1 practice plan and 1 final plan. Okay, so let me check. So, Katie, you're saying you don't have anything under your courses?
I don't.
Okay. Holly Yancey is our tech person, and she's not in the office right now, but I'm going to have her. So can you just bear with us? I'll show you everything today here in class, and we'll make sure that we get you situated so you can get into our Moodle site. We're also recording everything now, so anything that you miss will be posted as a recording in Moodle. But we'll get you connected to the Moodle site. You'll be good for this morning, though. Is that okay? Awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
Good. So, let me get some things situated here. You should be seeing a document now that's expectations in the certification process. Are y'all seeing that okay?
Yes, I see it.
Thank you. Good. So this is just a short overview of what we've just talked about, but I wanted to make sure that you have access to this. This will be in Moodle. So when I talk about this being a competency-based course demonstrating proficiencies by doing a couple of plans, we're going to do practice plan. A lot of times people do these with friends, significant others, spouses, kids, family, friends. And the idea of the practice session is this is not quite as formal or as important as something that you might do with a person who experiences a disability and is coming up on their annual plan renewal. So if you make a mistake during practice, it's okay. It's just something to learn from. So find a focus person for your practice session who is someone you're familiar with and they know you, and that it isn't a life and death sort of a focus for the plan. It should be just a chance to try out the different planning processes we'll talk about in class. there are also a number of documents for the portfolio that you won't have to include in your practice plan portfolio. We'll talk about those as we go through the documents here in just a minute. The final plan ideally should be a real planning session for someone who actually needs or wants to develop a plan. It may be a person who experiences a disability, someone who you provide services or supports for. It may not. In some cases, people have also used family, friends, significant others, etc., who actually have a focus that they want to work on to use for planning, and that's fine. The plans will be submitted in a portfolio format that demonstrates competency in the processes. The final plan requires all of those documents, and we'll talk specifically about what you don't have to have for the practice plan in just a second. There's a criteria checklist review that I'll use for going through your portfolio and looking at, is there fidelity in terms of what we taught in the class and what you've produced. And once you've met those criteria, again, you will be prompted to complete the survey in Moodle, and then to print your certificate of completion. For those of you who are care coordinators, Kara Thrasher Livingston has agreed that she will accept a copy of the certificate for completing this class, and that it can be counted as meeting some of the ongoing training and recertification requirements through SDS. So make sure when you finish everything up that you do the survey, print your certificate, and that you let Kara know that you've completed the class so that you can get credit and meet some of those recertification requirements. Okay.
Ken, where do we find that list you just had on there?
It will be in Moodle.
Okay. Under?
I don't know that it's in there right now, Kelly. I'll put it in at the end of the session, and let me just look here for a second.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. I'm just one of those people, I need that hard copy.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I appreciate that. We all learn differently. That's fine. I'll just put it in the additional resources folder that's in session 1. So when you open the course documents, you'll see the portfolio documents, the assigned reading, and I'll put it in folder number 3, the additional resources.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. When we were first doing the course design for this class, we envisioned it being 5 sessions. What it has actually turned into is we're going to cover all of the content in 4 sessions. There will be a break in the schedule after those 4 sessions, during which time you should be working on your project, your actually your final. Hopefully we'll get you through the practice before we finish up those content sessions. And then your final project, you'll have a couple of weeks, and then we'll have a final session where we get back together and debrief. It's mostly just to hear your experiences and for you all to share how the process went for you. So these sessions, as originally designed, aren't necessarily hard and fast, and will fly by the seat of our pants to some extent. So next week we'll be talking about different tools, planning processes. We'll spend some time talking about developing a plan and sessions. We're going to spend some time talking about both process and graphic facilitation skills. We're going to talk about the importance and power of developing a team, and the person-centered planning portfolio that you'll submit, putting it all together. So we've already done the introductions and what brings you to the class. So a quick question, how many of you have participated in person-centered plans previously? Okay, I see Kelly and Soldana. Anyone else?
Victoria has.
Okay. How about Kelly or Michaela? Have you guys participated in person-centered planning processes previously?
Yes, I
Okay.
have.
Okay. And what was there a particular process for any of you? And Katie, have you participated in a planning session?
Very little.
Very little. That's fine. That's fine. So for those of you who have participated in person-centered plans, was there a particular process that was used that you recall?
The process that we used, it was when I was managing a group home, and it was for a young man in the home. And it was very similar to these plans. We actually had the graphics, and there's probably half a dozen people there to support him in his story in moving forward with his life.
Okay.
And what he was wanting to accomplish.
Okay, good. Anyone else?
I would say for me, it's been about the same. We generally have a team meeting where we have everybody involved, including that person, and just really ensuring that that person, the individual, that we let them know that from the start that we're there for them and that they are the ones in charge of their plan and what it should look like and what they want in it and what they don't want in it. And then just asking questions throughout the meeting, checking in if they're okay, if they want to continue sitting with us during the meeting, do they need a break? Can we ask their staff questions about how things are going or not going? Just really ensuring that they're involved in that process.
Okay. Victoria?
Oh, I've never had a meeting where there were graphics involved, so I'm interested in learning about that.
Are you a good artist?
No, but I'm really good at a PowerPoint.
You don't have to be a good artist to be a good graphic facilitator.
Okay.
So that's fine. We're going to talk a lot about the importance of visualizing, particularly as we work with people who experience disabilities, intellectual disabilities here. Not restricted only to people with intellectual disabilities. It may be somebody who has, physical disabilities as well. But the power of those graphics can't be underestimated. It is the best way to engage people in that conversation is to be able to visually represent what that conversation is looking like as it evolves. And it also is an historical record that can be kept and can be revisited to see how are we doing. We said we wanted to do A, B, and C. Where are we at? Do we need to tweak things? So that graphic component of person-centered planning is something that's Really important, really important. Okay. So some things that we will not be able to do in this class. Um, the system of care is what it is. And some of us may love it and some of us may hate it. But it is there. And we're not going to be able to change it because we took this class. Hopefully we'll come away with some new ways of thinking about things, some new ways of advocating. That would be great. We can't fix funding or existing conflicts, and having a person-centered plan in no way guarantees people live happily ever after right off into the sunset. So those are things that I just want you to get up front, that this class isn't going to be able to address those kinds of things. Some things that we hope we will be able to do is help you get a good understanding of the values involved in these kinds of processes and reinforce those values with you. Um, uh, we hope that as a result of taking the class, that there will be that there will be a new sense of ownership and empowerment for the focus person. We will, Kayla talked earlier about asking permission, um, uh, engaging people in choice, empowering them to make choices, not doing anything without them, asking permission to talk to key people in their network of support. I think one of the most important things that can come out of person-centered planning is the connectedness to community supports and services, but with the distinction that, and a bias, that unpaid relationships in the community are every bit as, if not more important than paid services and supports. And this is a process that, if done with intention, can really look at how can we improve those connections? How can we enrich that network of support? How can we engage people in activities where others share a common interest and will, over time, potentially become a good friend? Someone who will want to be involved in the focused person's life, not because they're paid to do it, but because they like and enjoy spending time with that person doing different kinds of things. That's the most powerful piece, in my mind, that person-centered thinking and planning can help us move toward. So building that team is huge, and those connections. Okay. So we have, in developing this course, we've talked about demonstrating competency by completing portfolios and plans, and we've really intentionally, kind of, or arbitrarily, if you will, decided that there are 3 of some of the processes that have been used for years and years and years that are simple, powerful tools that lend themselves to planning that we're going to focus on. The first, Beth Mount's original work in personal futures planning, and then 2 processes developed by Marcia Forrest and Jack Pierpoint, MAPS and PATS. All of those processes were chosen because, again, they're fairly simple, but each and every one of them also incorporates graphic facilitation, graphic displays of some way, images, and a record of the process. But the process itself then leads the team to identifying, here's where we're at today, here's where we want to be a few years down the road, and here are some steps that we can take to get from here to there. So it sets up in such a way that there's an action plan that can then translate into a plan of care with SDS, for example. It is not an SDS plan of care, but aspects of this person-centered plan certainly can relate to and become a part of that publicly funded plan of care. But they're, in many ways, polar opposites, right? Okay. One's based on values, one's based on this sort of medical model, institutional model of care where you have to describe all of the things that's wrong with a person and how can we fix them and make them better. The other's based on, what does this person do well? What are the things they love to do? What makes them leap tall buildings in a single bound? How can we connect them with more people in the community? They're like polar opposites in terms of the functions, but they can merge in different aspects. And that's why we chose these three particular processes, as they develop a plan of action that can fairly comfortably be translated into and become a component of those plans of care. We're going to talk about those processes in some detail. We're going to compare and contrast the differences and similarities of different planning processes and tools. We're going to have you develop a plan. We're going to focus on basic facilitation skills and graphic facilitation skills. And again, the most important aspect of all of this when it works well is really putting together a good collaborative team. So it's not just somebody who's a care coordinator isn't always going to facilitate a plan for a client, for example. If it's person-centered, do I get the choice of saying I'd rather have my Aunt Sally do it than my care coordinator, who I see a couple times a month maybe, whereas I've known my Aunt Sally my entire life? So we'll talk about those wrinkles and aspects. So we talked a little bit about this. I like it when you're here, when you ask questions, when you comment, when you complete assigned work, honor the values of person-centered thinking, planning, and services, demonstrate an understanding of the materials, and more importantly, I think the values. It's hard to teach values, Sometimes I think it's just something that you come with, and other people you meet, you think, they just come from a different place, and their values, their value set's totally different. So I'm at least going to expose you to some things that are values related to person-centered thinking. I want you to demonstrate the ability and capacity to complete plans and develop a portfolio. So let's talk about the process a little bit and the portfolio. So for each of these plans, the practice plan and the final plan, you'll have an individual who will be the focus. It's their plan, it's not yours. You're simply there to facilitate the conversation. These things work best when there's a purpose. If the purpose is my waiver plan of care is due in 3 weeks, it wouldn't be as good as if the focus was, I feel like I'm not making progress. I don't have enough friends. It's hard for me to get around Anchorage. I love doing certain things, but I don't know anyone else who likes to do those. Those are good purposes for a plan. And again, learning through that planning process, you may find connections that translate into that plan of care, that service plan of care. So we're going to focus on, who is this plan about? Who is this plan for? And is there a purpose to it? We'll set up some tools for you to use. We have a pre-meeting checklist that will be used for the pre-meeting session, where the facilitator sits down with the focus person and goes through a variety of activities to kind of get ready for the planning process. Um, um, that includes taking a look at who are the people involved in this person's life, uh, and the nature of those relationships, so that we can get a sense of the richness of the circle of support for this person, as well as the needs in terms of the circle of support. It helps us figure out, where does this person spend their time, who do they spend it with, and what are they doing? And that leads us to, who should we invite to this planning session? When I say we, I'm really going to be asking the focus person, who should you invite? Who do you want to be a part of your team? Um, we is just, I'm a partner in the process, but it's not my decision. It's the focus person's decision. But that circle of support exercise and the pre-meeting exercise really sets everything up for going well or going abysmally awfully. Uh, we're going to record the process graphically, digitally, or by hand. Almost everybody now has a smartphone. It's unusual if you don't. And so digital images can also be used, but my preference is just the old school, let's graphically record the process. Throughout the process, while you're graphically recording it, it's nice to get a couple of pictures, though, of the team working together, of the focus person, maybe with the graphic behind them, of the interchange, the dialogue that goes on, to preserve that and to have that record. Um, so we've talked a little bit about the purpose of the meeting and the focus person, and it being their session. And in particularly in the path planning process, we ask people to spend a little bit of time dreaming and imagining, if everything was perfect a couple of years from now, and you were doing the things that you're really passionate about, what would it look like? And we ask them to describe it in terms of, what would it look like, so that we can graphically record it. And this particular slide that you're looking at is you see it's labeled as it's Dan's dream, and it's short bullets of information, and some simple sketches. Um, and those are really nice ways to connect people to um, the process. And you're constantly, usually you work in a tandem, where you have a process facilitator and a graphic facilitator working in tandem, where one person is simply doing the graphic recording, the other person is asking questions and engaging the person in the conversation. And you can see some themes here. So he's flying, he's doing different things, he's helping other people. He's got an interest in music and wants to build instruments, a variety of different things. And there's images as well as just bullet points of information. And this looks pretty nice. I mean, it's very colorful. It's nicely shaded. At the real session, sometimes you don't have time to make them look pretty. Sometimes you can just get the basic sketch on there and the bullet points, and then what you can do after the session is go back and, as another student said, we got back together afterwards and we prettied it up. And what she meant was you can see the shading here, the color, uh, that brings it to life. Sometimes in a planning session, you don't have enough time to do all of that at once, but you certainly can go back and do it afterwards. And then the finished product that you have that you give to the focus person is going to look something like this. So for that particular path process, there are several steps to it. We have a dream. We talk about a positive and possible future. That's always a slippery slope for a facilitator. It's that person's dream. Who am I to say that it's not possible? But if somebody says they want to go and live on Mars, it'll be challenging for sure. So our role as a facilitator is to nudge and guide and get people to talk about positive and possible futures. We ground the plan by describing what does life look like now. So the now is the section of the path plan. We enlist and enroll members of the team to be members of that process in an ongoing way. So person-centered planning isn't something that gets done once a year and then renewed a year later. It's a process that evolves and continues over time. I think that's where there are great differences in terms of the traditional service system and this approach to supporting people. Generally, those kind of ongoing sessions aren't seen to be real common. It's a crucial piece of this process, and you want to be sure that you have people who are enrolling who are not saying I'll be here next year when it's time for a renewal, but I'll be here the next time we get together to revisit the plan and see, are we making the progress that we should be? If we're not, can we tweak something to make it work better? If we've accomplished a goal, is the next one on the list? Do we know what that is? Can we talk about that? And that won't happen unless you have regular circle meetings where people come together to just check in. We want to make sure that we understand what works for the focus person in terms of getting stronger, or what do they need to have life work for them. For me personally, rituals come into play here. So if I recently had a problem with my phone and my alarm system didn't work, and I woke up way later than I should have woken up. I was going to be late for work, close to late for an important meeting, barely had enough time for a quick shower. Making coffee and having a cup of coffee was out of the question. And that day was a train wreck. So what keeps me going is my morning routine needs to be consistent. I need to sort of ease into the day. I need to have some time to wake up, and that time should be consistent. I need to make sure that I can get a little bit of caffeine after I've had my shower, and that I can get to work with enough advance time so that I can kind of ease into the day. That's something that helps me stay strong and get through my day. We want to discover what are those kind of rituals for our focus person. What are the things that make their day work for them? What are the things, and a part of this as well is discovering what are the things that really make it hard to stay strong. So let's avoid those things and move toward these things. We then start to talk about our plan and our actions to get there. So we're going to arbitrarily, we've got this dream that's a couple of years out here in the future. We're going to say, okay, it's a year from now. What have we accomplished? And the planning process is approaching it in that framework. We're imagining that this has already occurred, but what we're doing is translating our progress in terms of goals. So we're halfway to this dream that's 2 years out there. It's a year from now. What have we done? So Dan here wants to fly. I don't know if it's talking about going on a vacation or if he's taking flight lessons, but what does it look like 1 year from now? What has already happened? What did you do? What did you accomplish? And it might be I enrolled in flight school. I'm going to start flight school this month. But we ask the person to visualize it in that manner, that it's already happened, that you've already done this, that you've already achieved this. So there's always this sense of progress, of positive movement toward this dream that's positive and possible. From halfway there, then we move back and go through a series of shorter term objectives using that same principle. What have we occurred? What have we achieved, rather? So we go from halfway there to a month from today to tomorrow for first steps. What have we done? What are we doing? And you can see how that will turn into a pretty detailed set of goals and objectives, a broad dream with several check-in points to look at what are the things that we're doing to get from here to there. So it lends itself nicely to the planning process, or the plan of care process. So some of the things that will include as far as tools and things, the image that you see here on the slide, the checklist that's there, that's the criteria checklist that I'll be using to review portfolios when they come in. You'll have access to this, but you don't need to complete it. I think it's a good reference point to be able to, as you're getting ready to do your planning process, to kind of take a look at, do I have all the parts? Parts are parts. Do I have all of the parts covered? Do I have things set up the way they should be? Am I thinking about all of these processes so that it's congruent and makes sense? Once you've completed the actual meeting, um, um, we want to make sure you have all of those parts complete. So for the purpose of the class, we want the focus person to sign a release form that's part of the portfolio. That's so that we have their permission to look at the planning process, at the graphics, at the summary, without fear of violating privacy and confidentiality. There's an ethics standard form and assurances that we want you to sign off on. There's an evaluation form that, in a perfect world, would get handed out during the planning session, to participants, to members of the team, who would be able to then provide feedback on how the session went and this checklist. So let me get out of here for a second. And I want to share some forms with you for a little bit, and then we're going to take a short break. Thanks for your patience while I got things up here so we could share them. So the process that you'll go through after you've determined who your focus person will be is you'll have an individual meeting with that person. And we've created this pre-planning worksheet. Are y'all able to see that okay? Should I make it a little larger? Is it readable?
I can see it.
Okay, doke. So this is a fillable form, so it's something easy, and you don't have to have it right there at the session with you. Just take notes, but it's always handy to take a look at it before you go out to meet with the person. So the purpose of this pre-planning meeting is to sort of let's empower this focus person to own this process, to own this meeting, and to determine who's going to be involved in it. So there's some just simple demographic information about who's the focus person and yada yada. All of that demographic stuff is self-explanatory. Down here towards the bottom, is there a purpose for this meeting? So is there a theme to it? Is it something that it may be someone who's transitioning from living at home to living independently, or whatever the case may be. And then we want to share a little bit of information with the focus person about the different kinds of planning processes that are available, and assist them to understand that well enough that they can choose what kind of process would they like to use. And we've narrowed it down again to these 3 simple processes: MAPS, paths, and personal futures plan. And then a short statement: why was this one chosen as opposed to another? We also want to make sure that we spend some time exploring with the focus person whether or not there are any things that we need to have available in order for this meeting to be successful. So it may be an accommodation in terms of technology. It may be the location. Um, uh, it ought to be the option of the focus person to say, I want to do this in Aunt Sarah's living room because it's nice and big and it's open. Probably ought not to be. If I was facilitating, I would steer away from. It has to be in some service provider agency conference room between the hours of 8 to 5. And the people who will be present there will all be service provider staff. So those kinds of things, in terms of what kinds of things can we do to be sure that this meeting is successful. And then it says complete and attach a copy of your circle of support. So I want you in this pre-planning session to spend some time going through a circle of support exercise, and we'll look at that form here in just a second. And as a result of that exercise, hopefully we're going to be able to determine who are the people who we want to have participate in this team process. So who from your circle of support do you want to have assist with the planning? There may be in the last cohort, there was one of the plans was done with a young man, and they did the circles of support, and it wasn't particularly rich, but it wasn't impoverished either. There were a lot of people that he knew. But for his planning session, he only wanted 2 people to be there. He wanted the facilitator, his brother, and his dad, and that was it. It's his choice. So that's who was there. We then ask you as the facilitator to help that person develop an invitation. We want to invite people to participate. How do we go about doing that? 20 years ago, before everybody had cell phones and technology, we encouraged people to actually develop physically a flyer or an invitation or a brochure, and make it pretty and engaging and send it to people. more and more these days, it tends to be technology is being used for the invitation, but the function is still really important. Um, it's a chance to encourage people from this circle of support to engage and to attend and to participate. And so we want to look at um, who, what, when, where, and why are we having this planning process, and then develop an invitation that will encourage folks to participate. Um, Jack Pierpoint and Marcia Forrest, um, when they talk about person-centered planning, they don't talk about just processes. They generally frame it around team building exercises, and then inclusion. But their mantra is, in terms of getting people to participate in meetings, is that if you feed them and make the environment pleasant, they will come. And so the mantra of food, music, and color is important to set the atmosphere, assuming that the person, the focus person, is willing to do so. So are there particular colors that they like? That helps in terms of the graphic recording, if we know favorite colors. But it also helps to create an environment that's warm and welcoming. So we may have, we may have some fresh flowers as a centerpiece for the table, for example. And if there's a particular kind of music um, that people enjoy and it helps them to be comfortable and relaxed, can we have that in the background? And are there particular kinds of snacks or foods that the focus person likes that he or she thinks that their team might like? So we have all of those bases covered to make it an engaging environment. Um, Again, one of the students in the last cohort did a plan with a young man whose favorite music was pretty heavy duty rock and roll, but he was a person who experienced autism, and that sort of helped him to stay focused, to stay engaged. If people are planning and talking about him without that sort of stimulus there, that auditory stimulus, then he had just a heck of a time even engaging or staying engaged. So he had, I can't remember which band, but some heavy rock music going on in the background in his planning session. And it was critical to him that that be there so that he could stay focused on the planning process, and that music in the background helped him. I thought that was cool. Very great. And then last but not least, are there any conflicts of interest between the facilitator and the focus person? If you're working with a family, it's possible. If you're a paid caregiver, it's likely. So those kinds of things, we ask you to just think through this process. Okay. Let me, oops. So what you see here is a fillable template for circles of support. We'll talk about this in detail in a bit. The focus person is at the center, and then these 4 concentric circles represent people, places, and activities in their life and the nature of the connection there. So in that outer circle, the circle of exchange, are individuals who are involved in the person's life because of some sort of paid relationship. So it might be for example, it might be a physical therapist. You know, they wouldn't see one another other than this person is going and purchasing physical therapy services from them. It could be a doctor, it could be a nurse, it could be, the cashier at the grocery store. That next circle the circle of participation are people, places, and activities that are shared. And so think about your personal life and what are the connections? Who are the people who you share interests with in particular activities? So when I wasn't quite so old a dinosaur, I used to play rec league hockey. And so there were a bunch of guys that were um, hockey team members. Uh, some people are very engaged in the congregation of their church and they're very spiritual. And so some of those people would be folks. I'll tell you a story later on about a young person here in Anchorage several years ago who was a Star Trek fanatic. And she became pretty involved in a Star Trek fan club. And so those people were there. That next circle, friendship, are people who are our friends. Um, they're people who we see regularly and who we count on and depend on. We do things together with them. And life would be pretty dull if we didn't have them in our lives. Contrast that with that inner circle of intimacy, those who are nearest and dearest to us. And if they weren't there, we just simply couldn't manage. It would be too traumatic for them to not be involved in our life. That may be children, significant others, family members, those kinds of things. Now, the way those relationships work and evolve is that, generally speaking, the longer that we know someone, the better we understand each other, and we might discover that there are common interests that we like, and we may eventually end up finding out that the physical therapist also likes to go to movies, and I like to go to movies. And so after I've been going to therapy for a year or something, we might be talking about the newest Marvel movie, and maybe we could go and see that together, or whatever the case may be. The hockey team kind of thing, or the church congregation kind of thing, or the Star Trek thing. We share those activities, and that's the common glue that bonds us together there. And as we participate and share those activities, we become a little closer and a little closer than just a Star Trek fan, right? We might become a member of their club. We might become an officer in their club. We might go to conventions, whatever the case may be, and move into, while we still participate in that activity, that person may now become a friend. And eventually, over time, those friendships can become, some of them, more and more intimate and personal. And it's because of the shared activities, the shared time together, engaging in common interests. That's kind of how relationships develop for all of us. And so the circle of support is a nice way to check in, see who's in the circle. Are there huge gaps? Are there not a lot of places in there where there are people? And it's a way to check back periodically and see how are we doing. Are we engaged in more community activities? Are we engaged in things with different people than we were engaged previously? So circles of support. Does that make sense? The release form. I'm not going to go through this in any great depth or detail right now. It's simply a matter of making sure we have the focus person's permission to review the plan here, solely in the context of you taking this class. Straightforward, self-explanatory. I do want to look a little bit at the Code of Ethics. Oops. This is a 2-page document, and we're going to ask you to go through this carefully before you facilitate the plan, and take a look at the assurances and the values of person-centered planning in here, the ethical standards of providing person-centered planning, thinking, and support services. And then there's a place for you to agree or disagree. Well, there's no disagree. we want you to sign off on this and adhere to this ethical set of standards for facilitating plans. If you find it just, no, I'm not going to do that, then you'll just have to let me know, and we'll move on from there. But there isn't anything in there that's heinous or, going to ask you to do anything that's going to compromise folks. This is the evaluation that you might pass out at a planning session to participants of the team, and it just is a good practice as you engage in these activities to do these kinds of things for your own personal growth and development. It's a good way to encourage people to tell you, what am I doing well? What could I do differently? Those kinds of things, and get some feedback. And then last, there are a couple of portfolios here I wanted to share with you. Some samples. All of these are in session 1. I'm just showing them to you so you can get a sense of it. So when you turn your portfolio in, I'd like to see some of the graphic facilitation in some form or another. The invitation, who this is for. That pre-planning worksheet covers a lot of these kinds of things. So if you attach that pre-planning worksheet in this course, they provided a narrative summary. Who are the key people, the circles of support, the release form, and then this part I think is important, especially if you plan to translate some of the themes of this person-centered plan into paid services through a waiver plan of care, for instance. I think people at SDS who are processing those plans are going to be far more comfortable with narrative descriptions than they will be a graphic image. I think the images are nice, but a narrative summary can also be instrumental in incorporating those things into the plan of care. So a short narrative description. In this one, they did a pass, so they described what was the dream, what was the positive and possible future, all of those different steps in the path process. What's like the now, halfway there, a month out, tomorrow, all of those kinds of things. So short narrative descriptions, I think, are useful to translate things into funded plans of care. Another example, same thing. So I'm not going to go through all of those with you. Just I wanted to point out that they're in session 1 in the portfolio document section. Okay. It's 10:51. Let's take a short break. Can we come back at, we'll start again at 11:05. Sound good? Okie doke. Doke. Let's see if we can get back on track. So before we jump back into content, for those of you here in Anchorage, I have a family that I've known for a long time, that a number of years ago I co-facilitated a plan for their son. And I was talking with Mom recently about some other things, and she said, oh, by the way, do you know anybody who's still doing person-centered planning? Because we'd really like to update Justin's plan. So it's a great family. Justin's an amazing young man, and but it's a challenging prospect for facilitating a plan with him. He uses assistive tech for communication, and he processes information a whole lot better than anybody who just kind of casually sees him would ever anticipate. But his family's great, and they're looking for someone to facilitate a plan for him. So in terms of doing your portfolio, if you didn't have somebody in mind, we might be able to connect you with that family and help you move along in terms of completing the process for the class. And it would also be something the family's interested in. So just throwing it out there. If a couple of you wanted to work on it together and then kind of trade back and forth, one would could do graphics, one could do process facilitation, and do that for 2 plans. That'd be cool. You get a chance to practice both aspects, graphics and process facilitation. So anyway, just throw that out there. So if you think that you're interested in learning more about Justin and his family, and you would consider working on a plan for them, shoot me an email, and I'll try and help get people connected. I think it'd be a great way to go about it. So I want to get back into our content a little bit, and just to sort of put everything in perspective. Why are we doing this class, and where did it come from? And I want to revisit a little bit of Alaska's history. We're an enormous piece of real estate with not an awful lot of people in our service system. In terms of the bigger picture, compared to most of the rest of the country, is still relatively new. So just revisit some of the history, and then some of the events that have led up to this particular course being offered and developed. So before we were a state, we were a federal territory, and there weren't any state services of any kind here in Alaska. And if you were a family who had a family member with a disability, there were no services here, no facilities here. And so people were sent to the lower 48 for supports. So if you were a person with a developmental disability, that meant you went to some place in the lower 48 where they had what was then called an ICFMR, an intermediate care facility for people with mental retardation. They're now ICF IDDs, intellectual and developmental disabilities. But there were places down in Washington and Oregon where people were sent to receive care and services. Morningside Hospital. There was a place in Washington called Baby Louise Haven Acres, and they were all institutions. And so that was about as good as it got in those very early days. Over the course of time, when statehood occurred, there still wasn't anything here in Alaska. The first component of the service system actually was API, Alaska Psychiatric Institute. And even though it was a psychiatric institution, it was the only thing that was there. And when I was first getting started on my career here in the original old API building, there was a unit called the Kotsky unit. The Kotsky unit was named after the original physician who operated API, Dr. Kotsky. And the Kotsky unit was sort of like this terrible place where if you didn't fit into the regular realm of psychiatric treatment, you went to the Kotsky unit. So they had a little bit of everything there. And it wasn't just short-term care. There were people there who had lived there for a number of years, and the age range was from teenage through the end of the lifespan. And uh, a lot of folks who were there had a variety of different kinds of disabilities. Some of them had dementia, psychosis, duly diagnosed people, so an intellectual disability along with a psychiatric disability. Um, and it was like, if you ever saw the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it was like that, only a little bit worse. There was a nurse's station in the center where it was closed and all glassed in, and the doors were always closed, and the residents milled about and did whatever it is that they were wanting to do at that particular moment, which may have included walking around half dressed, half clothed, publicly masturbating, those kinds of things. Very little interaction. And then I was one time trying to work on developing a foster placement for a young man with autism who unfortunately ended up on the Kotsky unit. He was still in school, in high school. And so I spent some time observing there. It was really intriguing and interesting there. Everybody in this sort of, massive, really diverse people with diverse support needs, sort of unstructured milling about. And then at particular times, everybody would migrate into this day room, they called it, and it was hard tile floor with a large drain so you could hose it down in the middle, with chairs around the outside of the room. And you might recall those old ashtrays that sat about waist high. They had a big weight in the bottom so they wouldn't flip over. There were those kind of ashtrays about every 4 or 5 seats. And it was as if somebody had rung a bell or an alarm had gone off. People would migrate into this room, and without fail, then the staff would come through, and there were 2 staff, and one of them had a bunch of cigarettes and the other one had a lighter. And if you were in that room and sitting down, then you got a cigarette and the other staff would light it. It was the only time where there seemed to be structure. It was just terribly unhealthy, activity, but it seemed to work for them. So the Kotsky unit, yeah, that was quite the place. Eventually, Harborview Developmental Center down in Valdez was developed after the '64 earthquake. Governor Egan, who was a resident of Valdez, wanted to do something for his hometown constituents, and there was lots of federal disaster relief funds available, and they used those funds to replace what had been a small community hospital that also provided some nursing care for a handful of folks with disabilities. But the thinking was, we've got a number of people that we sent to Oregon and to Washington, and wouldn't it be great if we could get them closer to their families? And so Harborview Developmental Center was established using those disaster relief funds. And in its heyday, they provided services for up to 150 people. But it was an institution still, so you had all of those limitations. And it was the only place in the United States, I'm willing to bet a lot of money, it's the only place in the United States where you could go to public school forever. The Herman Hutchins School in Valdez, even if you were 30 years old, people from Harborview would get bussed over to the school Monday through Friday. And they would do, like a lot of pre-vocational kinds of things and that sort of thing. But it was a huge component of that community and of the culture there. So 150 people were living there, being taken care of. And eventually, after we had gotten to a place where we were no longer funding a bed in a group home, but we were developing service plans and funding those plans for individuals, it became kind of clear and apparent that there were better ways to support people, and serving people in the community was far and away a lot more cost effective than serving them in an institution. This was way back in the 90s, and even back then, the daily per diem rate for someone at Harborview was $400+ a day. There was one year where it was a particularly glorious Alaska summer, and the heating bill for 1 month in the summer, in June of that year, and again, 1990s economy, the heating bill alone for the institution was $70,000 because it had this really old, outdated infrastructure. So you're paying for a lot of things that didn't do very much, and it certainly didn't engage people in the community in any meaningful way. We, when I was at Mental Health and Developmental Disability, systematically worked through the process of transitioning all of those people into community individualized placements. It was really challenging. People in that community were terrified and up in arms and did everything in their power to prevent that from happening, but eventually it did. And some of the stories that came out of it in terms of people becoming connected and engaged in a typical community lifestyle were really powerful. Things that you just simply can't do in an institution, but you can do in a community. Pretty powerful things. And so it was sort of a little bit of the evolution of how things had developed. In the meantime, while Harborview was still open, Dot Truen was the woman who was the director of the Governor's Council on Disability. She was the first director. And Dot's mantra was, we have to start to look at serving people in the community, not just in institutions. And she was a thorn in the government's side in terms of the only thing that they funded was Harborview. And eventually she did, was instrumental, I think, in helping the service system get developed. There were some horrific floods up in Fairbanks. Usually during breakup times, they have, the Tanana Valley has ice jams and flooding, but one year there were some particularly devastating floods, and there were some people who with multiple disabilities who were supported in something akin to nursing homes. They were displaced because of the floods. They were put on a train and brought down to Anchorage. And that evolved into the first community-based ICFMR facilities through what eventually turned into Hope Community Resources, in those days, Hope Cottages. So again, it was for services and supports in small community-based sort of Medicaid-funded institutional settings where there would be a group of people with nursing staff and all of those other attending Medicaid requirements. Eventually, the state started to spend a little bit more money on community services. Those first services were all categorically funded, so they weren't paying for a person to receive a support. They would ask for service providers to provide a proposal to deliver X number of beds in residential services in group homes. And so they were literally purchasing a bed, and then you could put somebody from a list of qualified applicants into that bed, and life was good in their minds. Didn't have an awful lot to do with who are the roommates. Do you know them? Do you even care for them? Do you get along with them? It was just simply a way of managing funds and providing really limited kinds of service in terms of the qualitative aspects of those services. From residential services evolved employment services in the original days. Those were all center-based, congregate um, uh, workshops and work activity centers. Um, in the uh, in the early 80s, with the Federal Developmental Disabilities Act, things began to shift focus from sheltered employment for sub-minimum wage to um, individual employment in community settings with competitive wages. That's still evolving, but Alaska, I think, has probably made the most progress, although we have the smallest population, in terms of closing down sheltered employment options. That happened, at least for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, fairly early on in the 1980s. For the most part, most of those things were no longer existent. Now, there still are places where some minimum wage kinds of things were going on, but the sheltered employment piece was not common. In the At the same time that Harborview was closing down, Hope also entered into an agreement with then Commissioner of Health and Social Services, Karen Perdue, to decertify their ICFMR facilities that they had. And so Alaska became the first state in the nation that had no publicly funded institutional care. So people were all supported in community settings other than publicly funded and operated institutional settings. So it's kind of a big deal at the time. In the lower 48, they still had enormous institutions where hundreds of people spent their entire life. Similarly, in terms of employment services, lots and lots of employment places that were sheltered employment places, working on contracts where people made sub-minimum wages for doing things like putting together file folder systems for the Department of Defense and earning $15 every 2 weeks based on their sub-minimum wage and productivity rates. Totally segregated and isolated from the rest of the community. About 5 years ago, in 2014, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid made some significant changes to regulations. So we'll start a little bit with an overview of Medicaid eligibility. A couple of different kinds of services at Medicaid. If states agree to participate and use that program, there are some required services that states must provide, mandatory services. Each state has its unique state plan, so the nature of services are a little bit different from one state to another, and the populations who qualify for services are a bit different from one state to another. So what's available here in Alaska may not even exist in Colorado. But the mandatory services include those essential basic medical care kinds of things that you would think of: inpatient hospital, outpatient services, nursing facility, home health, physician services, et cetera, et cetera. EPSDT, early periodic screening, diagnosis, and treatment services for Medicaid eligible kids. So all of those fundamental services. EPSDT in those early days was important because it's a mandatory service. It's not optional, and essentially it required the states to do an annual screening of all Medicaid eligible children under the age of 18. And the purpose of that screening was originally to be a preventative healthcare mechanism. But what the regulations for EPSDT said was that each child would have this screening examination in order to diagnose any kind of existing disability or issue, and to provide treatment for those diagnosed conditions. So mandatory screenings, diagnose conditions, and provide treatment. That's required. So a number of other services for Medicaid are optional. Things like dental, prescription services, therapies, transportation, waiver services are optional. They're not required. So if you think back to EPSDT and those diagnosed conditions requiring treatment, that regulation also said it requires treatment even if the service isn't part of the state plan. So early on, those were some ways for families who were really struggling to try and access some more individualized treatments and supports for their kids. Some states were very, very creative in terms of using those EPSDT screenings and the resulting diagnosis and treatment. And I can't recall if it was Virginia or West Virginia, but they had an entire system set up where part of that screening was looking at social emotional development, behavioral health, and behavioral challenges, and an entire team of specialists who were able to diagnose those disorders and then prescribe applied behavior analytical services and supports for people with severe and challenging behaviors who otherwise would be institutionalized. ABA wasn't part of their state plan, but because it was done through EBSTAT and it was a required treatment based on this screening and diagnosis. So some states were very creative in terms of the application of EBSTAT. Here in Alaska, it was those screenings were predominantly done by nurses because the reimbursement rate was established at such a low rate. Physicians opted out and said, no, I'm not going to participate. Over time, it's evolved and changed, and more people, I think, are using it productively. But it's interesting in the one hand where you have a required service, a required Medicaid service that mandates treatment even if something's not part of the state plan. The home and community-based waivers, 1915C waivers, authorizes the state to provide home and community-based services for particular populations. Some of the rules that you can waive, hence the term waiver, is the comparability. So there may be different groups of people who the waiver supports and serves. It's connected to an entitlement to Social Security Act as the regulations that are actually waived. There's a pretty wide range of possible services that states can pick and choose from as they develop their waivers. They can be delivered via managed care. 26 states used waivers for long-term services and supports in 2014. There in 1950, roughly 300 1915C waivers in the United States. Now these data are old, and I think probably those numbers have increased. Again, in 2014, CMS decided let's look at our regulations. Now, even in those early days when I was at the state and we were developing those first regulations, the boilerplate talked about person-centered plans. They talked about outcomes and those kinds of things. And those were being pushed. They talked about care coordination as being a separate and distinct entity within the service system, not part of the service provider community. A lot of those things here in Alaska got waived because of geography, the availability of provider, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that happened throughout the country, even though we're distinctly different geographically, and the availability of providers in a lot of places, that was a common occurrence. And in 2014, Medicare and Medicaid said, we're changing our regulations. It's no longer are we encouraging you to do things. We're going to now implement new regulations that mandate that you focus on the quality of life of the recipient as opposed to the quantity and cost of services. They identified what services may and may not be provided. They defined what settings would look like in services that were authorized or not. They separated the care coordination system from the service provider system, and they added protections for residents. So now people, even if they live in a group home, by regulation, have to have the same sort of tenant rights as somebody who goes out and rents an apartment from a landlord in terms of a lease agreement and all of those sorts of things. So the setting regulation was really challenging when it was first presented, and it was intended to ensure people have full access to the benefits of community living, the opportunity to receive services in the most integrated setting appropriate. So that was kind of interesting. It's a set of a definition that's kind of a lot of bureaucratic mumbo jumbo. What exactly does that look like? I sat in on one webinar, and the presenter was a mom who had come up through grassroots movements in her local community and ultimately worked at her state, and then subsequently rose to work in the current administration in those days in health and human services. And she described a situation where here's how you can tell if the settings work or not. If you go to a community and there's a cul-de-sac, and on that cul-de-sac there are 4 houses, and in one house only people with disabilities live. In the other houses it's typical homeowners and families. If there's substantial differences between the rhythm and the routine of those homes, then we have a problem with settings. So essentially they're trying to really, really push the issue of people with disabilities receiving public supports to be a typical participant and engaged member of their community. And if settings prevent that from happening, then they're saying we need to revisit whether or not those settings are appropriate. So it was a dramatic shift in terms of, we thought having group homes was pretty nice, a pretty good deal after Harborview. Now all of a sudden we're saying, if it's on this cul-de-sac and the rhythm and the routine and the fabric of this living situation is dramatically different than those other houses around it, then we have problems. So an interesting departure. Integrated in and support full access to the greater community. So being able to seek employment, work in competitive, integrated settings, engage in community life, control their own personal resources, receive services in the community, and those options and selections are made by the recipient, not by the service provider community. Some of the qualities that they stressed were physical accessibility, choice of roommates, freedom to furnish and decorate their homes according to their preferences, freedom and support to control schedules and activities, access to food and snacks at any time, visitors at any time. So if you're working in a group home and you're supporting somebody who has Prader-Willi syndrome, somebody who has an eating disorder, pica behavior, things like that, access to food and snacks on demand anytime, 24/7, was a challenge, was an issue. But those are the accommodations that service providers are now forced to look at carefully. In the old days, I used to hear stories about, if there were 4 people in a group home and one person went home to spend the weekend with mom and dad and they came back and Monday night is movie night. And so all 4 of those people in the group home and the living care provider were all going to go to the movies. So the person who had a weekend visit with mom and dad just saw the movie 2 days ago with family and says, I don't want to go. Well, sorry, you have to go because everybody goes. So those were the kinds of things, the constraints that happen in those more congregately funded kinds of situations. And those are the kinds of situations that these regulation changes were intended to address. So lease agreements have to be in place, have the same responsibilities and protections as others under the landlord-tenant laws. Privacy in sleeping or living unit, choice of roommates, freedom to furnish and decorate, lockable entrance doors, so somebody can lock their rooms now. Previously, that wasn't okay. They took it a step further to say, here are some settings in which we will not use HCBS funding to support people. So all of those traditional systems, long-term care systems, are not okay. So we're not going to use waiver funds to pay for nursing facilities, API, ICF facilities, hospitals. Furthermore, can't be co-located on the grounds or adjacent to a public inpatient institution, location that isolates individuals from the broader community. Some of the larger institutions in the lower 48 had group homes on the campus of the institution. That would not be okay under these definitions. And so while first living in those large institutions, you might be on a unit where there were a number of people, and allegedly as you developed more autonomy and independence and skills, then you could transition from the larger unit to the smaller group home, still on the campus of the institution. Those kinds of arrangements won't be funded using waiver services. Any location that isolates the person from the broader community is not okay. And in terms of employment, shelter, any place of employment that employs only people with disabilities won't receive, can't be supported with waiver funds. If it's a sub-minimum wage situation, it can't be supported with waiver funding. And if it discourages full access to the community. So these settings definitions really were a major change for the service provider community. Excuse me. Rehabilitation over the years has sort of taken over from supported employment. So there's over time, if you look at the data, what you see is a decreased involvement in supported employment and an increased involvement in rehabilitation. So I think that's a factor, but also rehabilitation centers, not rehabilitation services, but centers, pardon me, that serve only people with disabilities are not something that are okay. They aim to meet all the recipients' needs for rehabilitation services. So a one-stop shop that's intended to do everything is not okay, and if it impedes integration into the larger community. In some places, they have small farm communities, residential supported living services model that are physically isolated, restrict access to the larger community, and is the kind of the one-stop shop where they bring all services to the recipient. Lots of times they're on a farmstead. Those are not okay. I went down to Iowa once when I worked at the state for their governor's council was sponsoring a conference that looked at individualizing services. And one of the things that they did was they took me to the county home. The county home was this institution where there were probably, I'm going to guess, 50 to 60, 70 80 people lived there. They all had some kind of disability. And when those were originally developed down in the heartland of America, they were these self-supporting um, small communities, if you would. Um, they had a large farm with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres that they farmed every year. They had livestock, they had gardens, they had, you know, everything. They asked us to have lunch with them, and they had us eat in the conference room with the staff, and uh, told us that everything that was on the plate was something that was produced on the farm, from the chicken and the potatoes and the vegetables. I asked if we could have lunch with the residents, and they said that would be too disturbing. That the residents always had lunch in the cafeteria, and that they always sat at the same table and in the same spot at the same time every single day. And I asked, what would happen if somebody said, I didn't want to sit at this table, I wanted to go and sit at that table and talk to Ken, this new guy. And he said, oh, no, we couldn't possibly do that, because it would be, it would be too stressful. It would ruin the routine. They had a big bus, a school bus. It was painted bright green, and it had the name of the county home on the side of it. And when they would go to town, everybody would go on the bus. And when along with staff, I mean, they didn't they didn't just pack up the bus and leave, and with the driver, staff would go with them. But everybody who went to town all had a T-shirt with the name of the county home on it too, so that in case they got lost, everybody in town would know who they were and where they were from, so they could get them back there safely. They were all compassionate, well-intended people, but could you imagine living in a place like that, where everything was done based on a set of rules that somebody else developed? So those kinds of things no longer are funded. And they also stipulated in the rule changes in 2014 that all service plans were to be based on a person-centered planning process. So, we're doing on time here. So this is where I think it gets sticky in terms of systems things. The way the waiver system is set up, the system will reimburse for one plan of care. And that plan of care is to be based upon a person-centered plan. So it's kind of, because of the way the system is designed, impossible to do this without having 2 planning sessions. And there's no reimbursement for at least one of those, okay? But the idea behind the regulation changes was that we want to empower people who are using our service system to be able to tell us what is it that they need to be successful in life, and to have choice and control in terms of who provides those services and supports for them, to not live on a farm where the only time you get to go someplace, you're herded onto a bus and you have to wear the Iowa County Home T-shirt when you go to town. So everybody looks at you like you're weird to begin with. And if you somehow wander off to do something you want to do, you're likely to be hauled back to the farm. So that's a systems issue that we can't change with this class, but I want you to be aware of of those deficiencies. Service providers will tell you that if they're not included in the person-centered plan or in the planning process, somebody goes out and facilitates a plan, and then they come and say, hey, Ken wants to have supported employment from Joe Bag of Donuts Incorporated. We sat at the meeting and planned that. And Joe Bag of Donuts Inc. says, well, we weren't invited to that plan, so we don't know anything about it. And now the expectation is we're on the hook to do this because somebody decided without our knowledge what they wanted to do and where they wanted to do it, and how are we supposed to be accountable for all of that. So there are all kinds of wrinkles within the system, even though these regulations were changed for good purposes and good reasons to improve quality of life. There are still a number of hurdles to get through. Okay. So this person-centered process offers the focused person choices. We're actively looking at revisiting progress and updating plans. We have identified uh, goals we should be focusing on. What is it that this what is it that this person does well? What are the things that he or she enjoy doing? What are their preferred outcomes, their desired future, a positive and possible future? What is it? What does that look like? Um, and what is it that we can do to accommodate all of those things to get from here to there? We also want people to struggle and grasp with the problem of the dignity of risk. A lot of times, and I hear this from people in the system and care coordinators, frustration with public guardians who are in the minds of the service system are inflexible because they're so overloaded with caseloads of 100+ people, they can't possibly do anything meaningful. And so if something comes up and it sounds like it might be a little challenging, they simply say, I'm the guardian, and no, you can't do that. Because if you do, it could make my job more difficult. And so the person-centered process is really challenging people to grapple with that whole idea of dignity of risk, that all of us experience activities and events in our lifetime that didn't turn out the way we anticipated, but we're still here. And when we fall down and skin our knees the first time we're learning to ride bicycles, it doesn't mean we should never ride a bicycle again. It means we should learn how to balance better and how to be able to do those kinds of things. And so those kinds of situations too are an embedded piece of the person-centered planning process. Supporting the dignity of risk, supporting the dignity of allowing people to make choices. And if they don't work out perfectly, it's fine because they learn from that experience. So in terms of those, the setting, both in terms of the nature of the services and the setting rules, as well as where do we do this planning process, that's something that is owned by the focus person, should be chosen by the individual. They ought to have the opportunity to seek employment and work. Alaska is an employment first state. And what that translates into, I mentioned to you earlier that there had been an increase in rehabilitation services and a corresponding decrease in self-supported employment services. Number of things go into that. Dehabilitation is far easier because you're not necessarily producing a product or an outcome. The reimbursement rate is not uh, for self-employment is not dramatically different from that of dehabilitation. And so over time, it became easier and easier and easier to support people who have pretty significant limitations in a dehabilitation setting as opposed to doing the hard work of trying to figure out employment. So now we want to support and encourage people to explore employment as a first choice. That may not be a competitive job as a cashier at a grocery store. It may be I spend some of my time volunteering in a community business. But the idea is that employment is an important part of our culture. It's valued, and so Alaska has adopted some statutes and regulations that say that we are an employment first state. So we want to encourage people to explore employment opportunities. But the nature of that should be at the choice of the focus person. We want to improve opportunities to be engaged in community life. We want to minimize the extent to which other people control their personal resources and provide them the choice to receive services. And some interesting things have happened in the last few years that help with all of those things. Supported decision making was passed last year, which is an alternative to public guardianship. Slowly that's getting implemented, and I think that'll make a big difference in people's lives, where we won't have a public guardian who has a caseload of 120 clients who says, no, I don't want him to do that because it's a little too risky and it would make my job harder. Let's take a look at a video real quick here.
From the origin of person-centered planning, we were trying to understand and see what it looks like when we just fit people into systems and defined their needs and saw them through the eyes of what a system needs for a person to be in order to generate the funding that's required and to basically service them. And system-centered work tends to be based on a medical model which assumes something's wrong with people, and it's the system's job to fix them. And so the system is invested in defining them in terms of their deficiencies and creating a treatment plan, and then working to help people get it right before they get to be members and be whole people in the real world. So person-centered planning offers a major contrast to that, which is to say that people don't belong to systems. They belong to themselves, they belong to their families and their communities. And if we see them in a different light by the capacities that they bring, and we understand that their communities are the place where they can contribute and be citizens, then our thinking shifts dramatically from how to fit people into systems and service them there to how do we support people to live good lives in community, and then how do we take what we need from systems and services so that services are not bad. They just tend to be wired for their own purposes, for their own self-interest. So a good person-centered planning process calls into question the way we use services and invites us to really change the way most of our services are configured to be more responsive to the people and the way that they want to live in the communities that they're in.
Contact us for more information, for a free demonstration or trial, or to sign up.
So that was Beth Mount. Any thoughts or comments or observations, reflections on that?
This is Victoria. I just finished up the care coordination full lives last week, and we had some really dynamic individuals who receive community-based waiver services. One has a dream of becoming a youth pastor. He wants to be married, but he cannot because, of course, people on Medicaid, they'll start to lose services if, their income goes up. We have another gal who sees herself as being a commissioner. She's very active in the world of, what's the right word I'm trying to look for? In disability services. I think she's on the governor's council, I think. But again, it's like what you said, Ken, you get paid for one support plan a year, and it's the medical model, and everyone's going to stay with that medical model until the person-centered support planning, in my mind, gets incentivized where people will get paid to do it, because there's no incentive financially or regulatory to do it, because everyone still falls back. There is some regs, I will modify that. There are some regs that are speaking to person-centered, but everyone still falls back on that medical model.
Okay.
And that's what I see.
I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I think in a lot of ways, subtle ways, or not so subtle, depending on your point of view, I think our service system is probably more institutionalized today than it was when I worked. When I worked on some of those system change things that happened in the mid-90s. I think in a lot of ways we're more institutionalized now than we were in those days. Things were much more individualized. Now we have, caps and 15-minute increments. Soon we're going to have electronic visit verification. It's, in order to access any of it, you have to meet a level of care and have all of this diagnostic stuff about all the things that don't work right. And then the whole plan has to be medically necessary services to ameliorate all of those medical problems. So it's a daunting system, and all of these changes at CMMS in terms of we're shifting the focus now to quality of life outcomes. There are times when you just feel like you're spitting in the wind because the two are sometimes so much at odds. Mm-hmm. But ancient Chinese philosopher said the journey of 10,000 miles begins with a single step. And so I think that here in Alaska, there are some things that are happening that are pretty progressive and have the potential to do some really good things. I think the climate right now in our country and in our state tend to be really stressful and make you wonder, how's it gonna, what's it gonna look like in a year, let alone, 10 years from now. It's a really challenging time, but it's good to know that there are people who are really invested in trying to work on making changes to our system that are going to qualitatively really improve the lives of folks who experience disabilities.
Yeah.
Let me share one more document with you. So this is just sort of piggybacking on what Beth said in her short little animated comparison. And this is also in Moodle for you. It's available there. So it's just a simple way to sort of compare and contrast how person-centered are we really in terms of um, person-centered approaches to services and supports as compared to traditional or system-centered kinds of things. And I'm not going to read through all of these. She described them more eloquently than I could ever hope to. I would touch on a couple of things, though, that the planning process, the actual process, is an art, and it isn't something that you can just do one time for a class and say, there, I'm proficient at it because, see, I got my certificate of completion. It becomes an art when you've practiced it, when you've used it. It's best if you can practice it as a focus person and feel what it's like to have a group of other people listening to you and sharing ideas and brainstorming about ways to help you achieve your dreams. That's the ideal and perfect practice. Um, uh, and it's like learning a new language almost. You can take a class in sign language and learn some basic proficiency in signing, but if you don't use it regularly, then you don't maintain that proficiency and soon you lose it. This process, this person-centered planning and thinking is very much like that. When it's practiced regularly, it becomes an art. We've just simply kind of reiterated some of the things that we think are crucial or important to making sure there's fidelity with these processes and practices. So make sure you have that pre-planning meeting. Decide what's the best planning process for this particular person in this situation. All plans must involve the focus person. I constantly hear people talking about, we're going to do a person-centered plan for Billy, but Billy isn't going to be there. Well, no, you're not doing a plan for Billy if he's not even there. I'm sorry, it is not person-centered. All plans ought to develop the circle of support relationship map and use that as a way to check in and see, do we have balance? Do we have increased participation and engagement in the community? Understand going into it that it's an investment of time, anywhere from 2 to 4 hours to complete a plan potentially. Plans usually, not always, but best practice is co-facilitators, one who's doing process facilitation, one who's complementing and doing graphics. All plans should have a written summary as well as a graphic component. Plans improve the quality of life of the focus person. The plans ought to focus and build on strengths, hopes, dreams, self-determination, and supports needed to be successful. So I'm not going to go through this entire document. I just wanted to introduce this to you as another source of information that's complementary to that short video that you just watched. Let me see here. So it's 5 after 12. Let's take a short 10-minute break and we'll regroup, and then we'll got about an hour to go and we'll wrap. Okay. So come back at let's restart at 12:15. So another short video I want to share with you as we get started here. So this is a video that was put together a couple years ago describing the developmental disability shared vision. And I think it's pertinent for us to be aware of what's going on in the background and how, I mentioned earlier, there's some pretty cool things going on that are encouraging in spite of all of the sort of stressful and discouraging things that we see in the news every day. And this is one of them.
Developmental Disability Services. A shared vision. Making it real. January 2018. Remember the shared vision? Alaskans share a vision of a flexible system in which each person directs their own supports based on their strengths and abilities toward a meaningful life in their home, their job, and their community. Our vision includes supported families, professional staff, and services available throughout the state, now and into the future. The shared vision is the outcome from over 200 people answering this question: how would you describe the ideal DD system? Over 70 people are involved in the system-changing effort. 5 project teams have been working for 6 months. Who's on these teams? People who receive services, parents, direct support professionals, members and staffs of the Governor's Council on Disabilities and Special Education, advocates, university professors and researchers, service managers, senior and disability services employees, STAR coordinators, independent living specialists, lawyers, care coordinators, executive directors. So what's been happening? Accomplishments. Clarified our definition of person-directed. I live the life I choose with the support I direct. Consensus on need for additional training requirements for direct support professionals. legislative bill to amend statute, the DD vision to drive Alaska service system, multiple videos under development to share stories of people living the vision. Examples of plans in progress: teaching people who receive services advocacy skills, mapping steps to a highly qualified workforce, creating a welcome video for people new to the DD system that describes services through the lens of the shared vision, You Know Me, Include Me media campaign, developing a more coordinated and meaningful approach to measure the quality of services. Why are we doing this? At an advocacy summit in September, 65% of self-advocates said they did not feel like they were in charge of their life. Alaskans with disabilities are significantly more likely to have a legal guardian than the national average. 96% compared with 55% in a survey sample. Nationwide, people with disabilities are asking for more control over their lives. Collaborating on the vision is building trust and strengthening relationships, promoting positive problem solving during challenging times. What's your role? How can you help make the vision real? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. An African proverb. For more information, contact Kim at champneyconsulting.com, the Governor's Council on Disabilities and Special Education, 269-8990, or toll free at 888-269-8990, the Alaska Association on Developmental Disabilities, director at aaddalaska.org, Senior and Disability Services, 269-2083, or toll free at 800-478-9996, or your local DD service provider. Thank you. This work is possible thanks to funding from the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority. And thank you to our many partners in this work. The Trust, Senior and Disability Services, Hope Community Resources, AADD, the Governor's Council, the Alaska Training Cooperative, and the Center for Human Development. And heartfelt thanks to the people who receive services, their families, and the individuals working every day to support meaningful lives. We cannot do this without you.
So, the video that you saw was produced the year that the bill was introduced to put the shared vision into Alaska state statute, and that bill actually passed last year. So the shared vision is going to become at least in terms of state statutes, it's going to become an integral foundation for the service system for developmental disabilities in Alaska, which is going to be fantastic. Kim's done a tremendous amount of work, along with all of those other people that you talked about in the video to get that thing up and running and in place. So I think especially in light of everything that we hear today, that at the federal level, entire programs are going to be zeroed out. At the state level, we're going to do away with Medicaid services as we know them now and turn them into a block grant. That was tried before and it failed miserably. Those are all really stressful and depressing kinds of things to hear. It's nice to know that some of these things actually were incorporated and passed legislatively. So to just kind of say we're going to dramatically do things differently is going to take a little more work than just saying we're going to do things differently. Also, another piece of legislation that passed that same year as supported decision making was passed an alternative to guardianship. Those statistics are stunning, aren't they? That 96% of Alaskans with disabilities have a legal guardian. In a lot of cases, there's, I think, a misperception that legal guardianship is the solution to all problems because that person is able to exercise control. And it is, the guardianship process is a legal revocation of civil liberties and civil rights. And so control is a big, huge piece of it, but misguided perceptions of control. So I think the supported decision making and the vision are going to be key pieces to the evolution of our service system that are going to dramatically improve quality of life of people who use it. Observations, reflections, comments about the vision. Any of you have direct experience with that movement, that work?
I don't so much have direct experience with that work, but I was working with a young man and who we did the plan for, and his ultimate goal was to no longer be under OPA's decision making and become his own conservator. He did become his own guardian. After a year, he became his own conservator. Just this year, we were able, my husband and I were his conservator for a year once he became his own guardian. But that was his goal, and he is living on his own and doing quite well for himself. Unfortunately, he is one of the folks that came from foster care, OCS, and then they just kind of dumped him on to OPA. He had no idea really what was even going on. He was with OPA for like 6 months before he ever met his guardian, his state guardian. And I think that's maybe where a lot of our guardianship comes in, state guardianship comes into play in this state, is the kids that come out of foster, if they have any type of disability, they seem to kind of just automatically get dumped onto the OPA pile.
Yeah, that I can't help but think, damn, I'm old. I was here and working for quite a while before OPA ever existed, and I knew, was personally and professionally connected with the first public guardians, and boy, it has just changed over the years. And now, I kind of think, if you believe in karma, that if you're a public guardian, you did something really heinous in a previous lifetime. Because I hear numbers that I just can't even fathom. People talk about, some of them have caseloads of upwards of 120 people. And, it would just be a virtual impossibility to do anything on a meaningful personal level. other than just shuffle paper, and try and manage chaos. And yeah, I don't know. It sure has changed over the years. It's kind of disheartening. But I think some of the things that are going on now with the shared vision and with supported decision making and uh, uh, interest in making sure that quality of life is an important issue, that we focus on gifts and capacities as opposed to medical model deficiencies and treatments. I think over time that's going to greatly improve our lot in life and our service system.
Hi, Ken. This is Victoria.
Go ahead.
I have a case where I have a stepmom who's the guardian conservator for an individual on my caseload. He's 38 years old and he wants to live in a group home. He doesn't want to live in his stepmom's house, but unfortunately, she purchased the home that they live in based on his income, on a 2-income, and that includes his income. And so it's a quandary. And so he doesn't get what he wants because he's got to live with his stepmom.
Wow, that is a dilemma. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the person-centered values would say, your life, your choice, right?
Right.
But those kinds of situations, those kinds of nuances are very real, and they're out there, and they're always there. There'll always be those kinds of dilemmas. How do you deal with that?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a good answer.
Yeah.
But that would be a perfect scenario if there was a team, and that team was, I think the construct of the team would be critical. You couldn't have a group of people sit down as a team and do a person-centered plan and have imbalance in the team or inequity in terms of choice and control and power, right? I mean, if you loaded the team up with a bunch of moms, cohorts, and it's a gang up on the young man, or the reverse would be true as well. I mean, it would be a perfect scenario for an equitable team to take that on and grapple with it. But it would have to be an equitable team, and that would probably be hard to find. But it could be a great focus for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other impressions on the shared vision video? Thoughts, reflections? Okay. So I just want to kind of get through the rest of this stuff. A lot of these are just images I'll share with you. So always in the planning process, we're talking about a desired future or a dream. Contrast that with Martin Luther King saying, I have a dream. He didn't say, I have goals and objectives. The planning process really is looking at a lot of things. We want to understand, who is this focused person? Who are they? Where did they come from? What's their history? How did, how has life played out for them? We want to look at where they spend their time, who they spend their time with, what kinds of activities do they engage in, and who are the people that they share those with. We want to capitalize on understanding what makes this person unique. What are their talents, their gifts, their capacities? And we want to capitalize on those things and build on them. Again, places. Where do they want to be? Where are they now? Is there great juxtaposition between their aspirations and the current situation? And then we want to develop an action plan, a set of strategies that are going to move us closer and closer to that dream. And they need to be positive and possible. There was one case in which a person who had a disability had lived with family their entire life, and they were now an adult, Mom was a senior citizen, dad had passed, and the adult child suffered an injury and had to go into long-term care to be stabilized. And when they started talking about um, discharge planning and transition planning, the person with the disability said, "I want to live with mom," and mom said, I just can't do it. I just simply can't do it." So positive impossible. Uh, how do we resolve those conflicts? And mom physically wasn't able to care for the person any longer. She'd done it her entire life. She was old and she just simply couldn't physically manage caring for this adult child with significant disabilities. So there had to be some planning process that came up with alternatives that would still meet the needs of both parties, the focus person as well as mom's needs. So I think listening is a huge piece of the planning process. We said earlier that this process can become an art as you practice it and develop your skills. Listening with your heart is important. This planning process can be really spiritually healing. It can help people shape their hopes and dreams and understand that it's okay to have hopes and dreams and move people safely toward their dream. It moves with people instead of over people. It empowers the focused person and supports and encourages the development of self-determination. How each individual wants to live should be consistent with how they are living. So the underlying assumption of all person-centered planning is that we're supporting that focused person. We're not doing things around them. But some of the tough situations that you grapple with later on in the class, I'll share some other videos with you. Michael Small is a person who's done a tremendous amount of work in terms of person-centered planning. And he talks about one of the aspects of this planning process needs to be to understand importance to and importance for the focused person. So what kinds of things are important to this person? And what kinds of things are important for this person? And those are considerations that have to be grappled with. Sometimes important for takes on a power of its own in terms of health and safety issues and concerns related to those issues. Importance to may be dramatically different from those. And it's not to say that one is more or less important than the other. It's simply a reminder that our planning process must be diligent in thinking through all of those aspects of a person's life with the goal of promoting self-determination and autonomy. So in that pre-planning meeting, we talked a little bit about circles of support and making those meetings meaningful. Grief can take care of itself, but to get full value of joy, you have to have somebody to divide it with, according to Mark Twain. So the idea and the notion of the importance of friendships and relationships and connections in the community can't be underestimated. The importance of those things are huge. Start with a circle and then map things out. We want to create interdependency, not independence or dependence, but interdependency. So developing a network of people and acquaintances and friendships in which there's reciprocation in terms of the relationship and the participation in the activities. There's continued support and nurturing. And the intent of all of this is to another another concept that we'll talk about in the class, and I'll share some information, is John O'Brien and his wife Connie Lyle O'Brien, in some of their very early work, talked about 5 valued outcomes. That ought to be a component of, or a consideration of, all of the planning that we do. So we're helping people have a presence, not just physically located within the community, but a presence to where they actually matter. Their being there is important to them and to others. Are they making contributions to the community? A variety of different things. We'll get into that in another session in more depth and detail. And that circle of support is going to help us again to decide who to invite to be members of this planning team. What would you do in developing connections and friendships and relationships if you didn't have a circle of support? Where would you start? How would you nurture relationships and friendships? So let me tell you the story I mentioned earlier about the Star Trek fanatic. Years ago, a colleague used to work for a service provider agency here in Anchorage, and she was a live-in caregiver in a group home that supported 4 young women. And it was in the olden days, so they had group home movie nights and all of those kinds of things that we talked about a little bit earlier. But Pat was really pretty progressive and was intuitively trying to help all 4 of these young women become as independent as possible. One of them was a Star Trek fanatic who drove her crazy because virtually 100% of her waking life, it seemed like to Pat anyway, was in telling stories or talking about Star Trek. And Pat had lived with this same group of people for a number of years, all 4 of them and Pat in the same house, and she was like up to her eyeballs in Star Trek. And so at one point she said, let's look around and explore and see if there are other people in Anchorage who love Star Trek as much as you do. And so it was an attempt to sort of redirect her constant chatter about Star Trek and hopefully, get her engaged with another group of people who really cared about it. Pat had become entirely disgusted with Star Trek after hearing it for years and years. And so they discovered that there were actually several fan clubs in Anchorage, Star Trek fan clubs. And so she and this young woman found out where one of the clubs, which was relatively close to the group home that she lived in, met and their schedule. And they showed up one night for the Star Trek fan club meeting. And they just went in and kind of were observing and listening and trying to get a feel for what it was like there. And people looked at them and wondered who they were, but they didn't really interact very much that first time. And so they stood around the edge of the room. If people interacted, they would typically come up and talk to Pat. The young woman physically looked a little different than the rest of the people in the room. And so if there were questions or interactions, they would ask Pat. But that first meeting was just kind of a, let's observe and see what goes on. And both sides, the fan club members and Pat and her charge, were both just kind of feeling things out, not a lot of interaction. When they showed up the second time, people would begin to ask questions, and they would always ask Pat. They never interacted with a young woman with disabilities. And over a period of time of taking her to those meetings, Pat got to the place where when someone would interact or ask a question, who are you, why are you here, what are you doing, she would redirect them to ask the young woman. And she was quite honest with them and said, she's a Star Trek fan. I'm not. I support her, and she wanted to become involved in your club, so I'm giving her a ride here. Eventually, they got pretty accustomed to Pat and this young woman being at the meetings. And pretty soon, at one of the meetings, one of the people came up to Pat and said, hey, you know, we've been talking with her. We know where you guys live, and we've got 2 or 3 members of our club who live pretty close to where you are. We also know that you hate Star Trek, and we feel bad that you have to come and sit through this every meeting so that she can be here. We would happily give her a ride to and from. So Pat was like, cool, we'll try it out and see how it goes. And it went grand. So her young woman who she supported in the group home was now a member of this club, was participating. Pat wasn't having to stand around and watch and provide transportation. Life was pretty good. One day somebody came and knocked at the door and they said, you know, we're having elections at our club for our officers of the club, and we wanted to ask you if you thought that she would be a good secretary for our club. We're not very good at keeping track of details, but what we notice is she has a memory like nobody's business and remembers every single thing that we talk about. So we wanted to ask her if she'd consider running. She did. She was elected. They had somebody help her with the minutes and notes, but she had like this great memory, and so everything was recorded. People were extremely happy. She was a member of the club. She was an officer of the club. Later, about a year, again, someone comes and knocks on the door. Pat invites them into the home, and they said, we wonder if she has any money. Pat's radar went up a little bit. And she said, why do you need to know whether she has any money? And they said, well, there's a national Star Trek convention coming up in a couple of months in Las Vegas, and all of our club officers are required to go. And we wanted to know if she had money for, for her ticket. And they said, she'll be fine with us. We'll fly with her and accompany her and make sure everything's okay at the convention, but she really needs to go because she's our club secretary. So it's a great example of how this circle of support stuff works in terms of developing connections, developing relationships, and how that sort of builds from usually, like in this case, a shared interest in Star Trek, participation in that shared interest and associated activities, to becoming somebody who's standing against the wall quietly while others ask Pat questions, to becoming the secretary of the club and traveling to Vegas for a national convention. A great illustration of how that circle of support and the notion of participating in commonly shared interests can develop those natural connections and relationships in the community. So finding out what makes people excited is a good thing to do. And there's a ton of different ways to do the mapping. We've given you the one that you can easily fill in electronically and submit with your portfolio. You can also just draw circles on a piece of paper and jot names down. When you do your portfolio, if you put a name on there, for my purposes, to be able to understand the relationship, it might be nice if you put Ken dash instructor, so that there's a context to the relationship that I can see as I look through your portfolio. So the nature of the relationship. So those intimate connections, you know, could be roles as opposed to names, I suppose. Like it could be mom, dad, husband, wife, child, daughter, sister, brother. Those kinds of things are fine. But as you get into the friendship, participation, and economic exchange, it's nice if you clarify the roles of the relationship with not just a name, but it might be Dr. Ken, or in participation, it might be Ken, the Star Trek dude, whatever, you know. So make those kinds of notes on your circles, and it makes it easier for me to see. We've talked about those circles and how they work. Here's an example of a pretty rich circle of support. This is figure 2. This is after mom realized, this is a single mom with a kid with a disability. This was after she realized that her life was sort of on the precipice of falling apart. And they started off by looking at her circle of support and realized she had nobody involved in her life. Nobody. And so if there was a catastrophic event, a crisis, or something of that nature, who was she to fall back on? There was no one there for her. And so over the course of a year, she focused on reconnecting with friends, with previous friends, with relationships, and trying to enrich her circle. And this is what it looked like after a year. This is what it looked like in that first year. And this is also illustrative of often what you would see with a focused person as a person with a disability. And what jumps out at you here is that there's overall not very many people involved in this person's life. And those who are predominantly are there because of some sort of a paid relationship: the bus driver, the teacher, the social worker, the nurse, the therapist, the doctor. There's only one person on here who's a friend. And the others in the intimate circle are family members. And it's a given that we would all expect our family to be intimately connected with us, right? A number of people with disabilities, my experience has been people who experience mental health disorders, as they become young adults, don't seem to be nearly as connected with their family as do people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So even in that regard, there may be a lack of connectedness. Excuse me. Some different formats. Again, this one simply asks you to identify relationships in quadrants. So who are your friends? Who are your family? Who are the other people that you're connected with? It's the same exercise, a different template. This one starts to talk about, again, the nature of connectedness with different kinds of relationships or roles. And that's all, folks, as far as the PowerPoint's concerned. So questions, comments about today? Okay. Again, for those of you from Anchorage, give some consideration to whether or not you might like to facilitate a plan for the family that I mentioned, or co-facilitate. And when I was talking about co-facilitating, you might do this twice, so that you get a chance to be a process facilitator and a graphic facilitator. That may be hard to do in terms of your schedules and times. I understand that, but it would be a great planning focus for this young man. He's a young man now. He lives here in Anchorage in a small residential community. His family still lives in their family home. He lives independently with supports. And they're looking at, what does life look like here in the future for Justin, and what kinds of things can we do to make those happen. He's been out of school for a while now, does a variety of things. He's a really intriguing, interesting young man, a great kid. He's not a kid anymore. A great person to be around. So if any of you are struggling with thinking about who might I use as my focus person for the final process, that's an opportunity, and let me know by just jot me a quick email and we can kind of go from there. So we'll meet again here, same time, same station next week. I'm going to have Holly follow up with those of you. We'll try and make sure we get everything fixed so you can get into our Moodle class, and she or I will send you an email. So that was Kellyanne, Michaela, and Katie. Didn't have access to Moodle, so we'll try and get that fixed today and let you know how that goes. So, any other questions or comments? If not, be well, have a great day, and I'll see you next Wednesday.